consider this. What is one right that men have had since the Constitution was ratified that women have only had since the end of World War I in America? The right to vote. Now, the right to vote has always been a privilege granted to men in America, but women have always had to fight for it. Now, as I have studied with the fight for suffrage in America and in Great Britain, I've come to realize that the American suffragette movement was influenced by the Women's Social and Political Union of Great Britain. And on October 10th, 1903, Emmeline Pankhurst created the Women's Social and Political Union to advocate for women's suffrage. And today I'm going to be talking to you about not only how they fought, because their fighting tactics were much different than what many other British women's suffrage movements had used prior to the founding of this union. I'm also going to be talking to you about how their actions influenced the late American suffragette movement that ultimately led to full suffrage rights for women in America. Now, to better understand how the Women's Social Political Union was successful, we first need to understand how exactly they fought. So they were known as a militant wing. So they used militant tactics such as chaining themselves to government buildings, throwing stuff in protest, throwing acid in mailboxes, breaking windows, and pretty much putting their lives on the line and being arrested just to fight for their rights. And this caused them to be at odds with many other women's suffrage groups such as the Labor Party and the National Union of Women's Suffrage Society. This kind of divide between the two ultimately led to, in 1905, Emmeline Pankhurst's daughter, Christabel, in one of these massive militant protests, was arrested for heckling Sir Edward Grey, who was a profound member of society at this time. And this was following a campaign of property destruction where women in the Union were throwing acids in mailboxes, breaking windows, and chaining themselves in government buildings, and once again, putting their lives on the line just to fight for this right. And this kind of led to, and shows, an all or nothing approach. They were facing death 24/7. Many women were okay with dying just for this cause, even if it didn't mean that their death would lead to actual suffrage. It would help in the aid and in the fight for it. And due to this, there was massive outrage in Great Britain in 1918, and as a result, Parliament granted partial suffrage rights to women over 30. So it was a success of the Social Political Union, but it still wasn't a full suffrage granted, so the Union still had a ways to go in their full fight. Their full suffrage did not come until later in 1928. And now that we've discussed how the Women's Social Political Union fight, now we're going to talk about how the American suffragette movement, more specifically the late American suffragette movement, was influenced by the militant actions of Social and Political Union. And in Bridget Kano's article of Women and Social Political Union, this militant wing ultimately started because of those odds, and the odds between the Labor Party and the National Union of Women's Suffrage Society. That divide and that fight ultimately led to the upbringing of the late American suffragette movement, caused by a very infamous Susan B. Anthony. Now, in her book, in Rebecca Schonger's book on the women's right to vote, Susan B. Anthony, it states that the events of the Women's Social Political Union led to the American Women's Suffrage Union led by Susan B. Anthony. Now, young Susan B. Anthony followed the views of Emmeline Pankhurst in terms of they wanted to fight. They were done trying to give polite speeches to government representatives. They were done passing out miniature pamphlets in hopes that something would change. So Anthony followed the views of Pankhurst and was a young noble suffragette giving speeches all over the nation. Her most infamous speech was the speech revolved around the phrase, "Failure is impossible." In her mind, failure to give suffrage to women was impossible. Society was ever evolving, and it cannot keep evolving further into a better society without granting women such a basic right to express themselves. And she dedicated her life to suffrage, ultimately creating the National American Women Suffragette Association. And she devoted her life to suffrage like many other British women did prior in this Women's Social Political Union. And her mindset, she would face death. In fact, she died well before America was granted full women's suffrage rights. So overall, both Pankhurst and Susan B. Anthony were pivotal roles in the English and American suffrage rights. In 1920, a few years after Susan B. Anthony died, the U.S. government finally granted women full suffrage rights. And in 1928, Parliament finally granted full suffrage rights to British women. So all British women 18 and older were finally allowed to vote. And so, in summary, on October 10, 1903 was a pivotal day in the future of women's rights as a whole, but more specifically, a women's right to express themselves in their own country and have a say in how the government runs things. And overall, today I've talked to you about how the Women's Social Political Union fought and how those fights led to the late American suffrage movement ultimately gaining success in granting those rights. So think about this as you think about the upcoming election in November. Remember who fought for some of your basic privileges in the democratic society that America is.